Okay, I think we'll start. Shalom, how are you? Now, if the other people are missing this week, I don't know what's going on. Okay. Okay, so before we start today, which is week 7 of the series, Navigating Daily Struggles, today's actually the last one of this particular series. But then what we're going to do is, I'll send around the details via WhatsApp, but we're going to do another 2 weeks, just a short 2-week series, where we'll share some new insights on personal freedom to do with Pesach and that whole journey. That's next week, the 27th, and the week after, on the 3rd of April. And that will bring us to the end of the term. So today's the last one of this particular series, but then we'll do a short series, just a 2-week series. Okay, so this term series that we did, and a bit of last term as well, was actually quite a bit of it was based on the book that I spoke about called Letters for Life, this book, which is based in part on letters and stories and explanations and insights on these topics of well-being and emotional health and daily struggles and things like that, written and things that happened with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He wrote extensively on emotional issues. He wrote extensively on lots of things, but there's many, many letters and stories and conversations he had with people in terms of their various struggles. And this was a recently published book where a lot of it was put together in a sort of organized and structured fashion. So today, we're going to end the series and we're going to actually do the last chapter, which is called The Courage to Change. And the concept here is that everything we've spoken about for the last 2 terms, actually everything we always speak about really, is based on the foundation, a foundation, right? And the foundation is that we can grow and change, and that we do have a choice, right? That's such an important thing. Which means no matter how embedded our problems are, and no matter how big and negative and toxic our experiences have been, whether they're toxic habits or toxic emotions or failures, physical things, spiritual things, whatever they might be, emotional things, whatever it is, we can always make progress, right? There's always hope and we can always make progress. Which comes with a very important idea also is to do with age, and that is that it's never too late to change, right? People sometimes, as they get a bit older, they think that's it. I am who I am, and zeu, as they say in Hebrew. No, it's never too late to change, never too late to learn, and we can always do that. Now, the chapter starts with a thing which I'm familiar with, but it's an interesting little background to a guy called Professor Reuven Feuerstein. His son was once here. His son actually once spoke here on a Thursday morning. So Dr. Feuerstein, or Professor Feuerstein, I met him once. He was once in Melbourne, actually. He was born into a Jewish family in Romania, and he was a war survivor, narrowly escaped the Nazis during the war. He learned by Piaget and other great educators and philosophers in Switzerland, I think it was, and he then came and he developed what's now known as he passed away already, but there's a whole institute called the Feuerstein Center, who deal with kids. They came here, his son came here, and then he himself came here many years ago. And he developed this whole idea based on what he'd learned from his teachers, but also what he developed himself, and that is that kids, even kids who are struggling in different ways, or intellectually struggling, or have lost hope or despair, there's ways to reach them and there's ways to let them progress, right? And then when he came to Israel and he started this whole Feuerstein Center, eventually he went even stronger than that. He went even deeper than that. He believed that even kids with chromosome issues, like kids with Down syndrome and things like that, so much more can be done with them. And he has this most amazing method of learning and helping and unbelievable. And this whole video of him telling the story that as he started this whole process, he suddenly started getting referrals from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher was spent, people coming to him. He was sending families with their children to him. I don't think at that stage he'd even met the Rebbe at that stage, but he said he started getting referrals, and either the Rebbe had written him to himself that I want you to speak to this family, or was sending families to him. And he says about one particular case, he tells a story that he calls it the worst case that he'd ever received. And it was a young boy who was falsely diagnosed as mentally defective in the country where he was born. And he was placed in a school with deficient children. In other words, he was placed in the wrong environment, which can also have a big impact sometimes, right? And this kid became a real problem, really bad friends. He became completely dysfunctional. And he just wasn't properly functioning as an independent human being, right? So at some point, the father of this child went to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe referred him to Professor Feuerstein. So he said they worked with him, and actually it was successful, and it went well. But then he left the center, and he just went back. He went back to his old friends, and he slipped back to his terrible habits, his reckless habits. And he went to a very dark place of all kinds of drugs and substances and all kinds of things. And the way he puts it is, even he puts it, he said he went to a dark place from where very few people return, right? And he was very, very upset about it, and he contacted the Rebbe for some advice. And the Rebbe said, don't let him out of your hands. Send somebody to find him, bring him back, and continue working with him, right? He said he did not believe that rescue effort would be successful because he was just so far gone. But because the Rebbe instructed to do that, he decided to give it a try. He sent someone to take this young person away, brought him back, was successful, started working with him again, rebuilt everything he had built with him, and when he tells the story, that boy then grew up and he was married with a family of 4 children, and he was a very successful and functional human being, right? So he says, when he told the story many years later, he says, as a psychologist, he said, I would never have believed that such a turnaround was possible. Usually in such cases, we just raise up our hands and give up, but the Rebbe didn't give up. And that was very, very much his philosophy. But the point I want to make is, it's not about his philosophy, it's about the philosophy that we should have about other people, and particularly the philosophy we should have about ourselves, right? Because sometimes we feel that it hasn't worked, we've done it too many times, we've tried too many times, we've formed certain habits, we've gone to certain places emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, whatever, and that's it. And the point of all of this that we've talked about, with all the struggles that we have, whether it's anxiety or worry or self-criticism or whatever the things that we've talked about, it all has to do with the belief. It can only work, all the strategies, everything we've talked about, can only work if we actually believe that we could grow. If we actually believe that we could grow, actually believe that we could change, right? Which is essentially the whole foundation of something that I've mentioned many, many times, based on a verse in Tanakh, that human beings are called walkers among those that stand, meaning it's a verse from the prophet Zechariah, and he talks about walkers among those that stand. And those that stand, according to the commentaries, are referring to angels. Angels might be holy human beings, but they are stationary, they don't grow, they don't change. They are who they are, the way they're created, the emotional disposition they have, and apparently angels are very emotional beings, and the personality, or whatever an angel personality looks like, whatever they have, that's what they are. Might be very holy and very beautiful, but it's set in and it's stationary. Whereas a human being, of course, is different. A human being may fail, make mistakes, and that's what the human being design is all about, but we can always come back and we can always make progress. All right? I know it's a bit early for this, but it is Pesach in a few weeks. And I once shared with you this idea, so let's say, because it's so relevant to this topic, that's the difference between chametz and matzah, right? You might remember this. We eat on Pesach, we eat matzah, and during the year we eat chametz. On Pesach we're not supposed to eat matzah, we're not supposed to eat chametz, only matzah. And chametz, we said, is the symbol of ego, because it raises, and matzah is the symbol of humility. But the fascinating thing is that matzah and chametz are the same letters, except for one. Right? So the chet and the mem is the same letter. Only difference between the chametz and the matzah is the hey and the chet. And the hey and the chet are very similar. The only difference between a hey and a chet is that one little top on the left-hand side, hey has a little opening, whereas the chet doesn't, right? And I explained to you one of the ideas behind this is it's a very, very beautiful and powerful idea. And that is that the empty bottom of both the chet and the hey represents failure when you drop out, right? The difference between the chet and the hey is that the chet is someone who said, I've messed up, I am who I am, accept me, I'll accept myself, and that's it. I'm not coming back. I'm not reconnecting, I'm not repairing, I'm not improving. Whereas the whole point of the hey is to have enough humility to say no, humility and belief in oneself at the same time, to know, no, I can creep back. There's a small window on top there, that if I try hard, I can climb up and creep back in, right? So that's the hey, and that's the holiness of matzah. So let's break this down a little bit and talk about it. So, one of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, one of his teachings was the following, based on a midrash, that we read in the beginning of the Chumash, the beginning of the Torah, that God created the world with 10 utterances, right? 10 sayings. Let there be light, let there be trees, let there be the sun and the moon, and so on, until let there be the human being. And from the simple reading of the Chumash, it appears that God created a world with 10 sayings, 10 creative utterances, and that's it, and he left the world keep going. Baal Shem Tov believed that it's not like that. Actually, that God recreates a world every single moment. Those 10 utterances are being, so to speak, repeated, whatever that means in God speaking. He doesn't have a physical mouth, but those 10 utterances are regenerating every single moment, and there's a renewal of the creation every single moment, right? Because the Baal Shem Tov explained that the world coming to make room for a physical world in the context of infinite godliness that existed before the world was created is something very novel and very new, and for it to continue to exist, it can't just be created once, it needs to be created all the time. Just to explain the Kabbalistic idea behind this, so the analogy that's given is, when you throw up a stone, right? If you let a stone follow gravity, it'll just keep going, it'll keep falling. But if you throw up a stone against gravity, in other words, something that's new that's a new idea, right? So we know that the stone will go up, but then it'll fall down again. Why? Because the stone can only continue going up as long as the force that you put into the stone continues. Once that force runs out, the stone just naturally goes back to its default position, which is to come down, right? Baal Shem Tov explained, and the Alter Rebbe, his student explained it in the book of Tanya in greater detail, that it's the same idea with the world. The default position of existence is not for there not to be a world. The default position, as Kabbalah teaches us, that before the world there was just an existence of infinite godliness. So the world is something new. It's like the stone going up, right? And therefore can only continue to sustain itself in existence if the creative power that God put into the world continues to be generated all the time. It props up the world, so to speak, right? But what that means, that's the way it is, nobody explained, right? However, what that means is, it allows us, this concept is such a powerful concept, because what it does is it allows us to, although of course with the creation of the world came the concept of time and space, and of course things are linked to each other and moments are linked to each other and so on, but this idea of the world being newly created every moment, as the Rebbe writes, gives us the ability to break free from the shackles of the past, as he calls it, right? In other words, that every day especially, but every moment really, but every day particularly, we wake up in a new world, a fresh world. A world where there's new hope, new abilities, new power, new opportunities, right? Now, of course, we learn from the past, and we do that, and we draw on experience, and so on, but the concept that every moment is distinct, and every moment is in fact new, every moment is something different, it's not the old, same old, right? Teaches us that we're never embedded in anything. In other words, it's a new world, it's a new existence, we are new. Particularly when we wake up in the morning, which in a big talk that everyone's explained, this is the spiritual reason why God designed human beings to sleep. Right? Why? Because if we wouldn't sleep, we'd continue on the same thing as before. We sleep to remember that when we wake up, it's a completely new existence. Right? And therefore, because it's a completely new existence, we can start over again we can renew, we can repair, we can improve, and we can always grow. We're never tied down, we're never bound to the mistakes, the failures, the toxicity of what happened yesterday. We always can start new. There was in the chapter of the book, it tells a story about a guy called Jerry Grafstein. I don't know who it is. He was a businessman, and he was also a long-time member of the Canadian Senate. He's also connected to Pesach, actually. He was once in New York on a diplomatic trip, and he scheduled an audience to consult with the Rebbe about his public affairs. And the Rebbe was listening to him, and he also gave him some practical advice on different things. But the Rebbe could see that this Jerry Grafstein, something was bothering him, right? So that he hadn't yet brought up, and the Rebbe noticed this, and he said, "Tell me what's on your heart." So he said, I told him that I was no longer young, and I was starting to think about what I'd managed to do in my life, and what I still had time to accomplish. So when the Rebbe heard this, the Rebbe wasn't a big fan of this talk at all. Many stories. The Rebbe said to him, "Do you know how old Moses was when he started his career?" Does anyone know? No, when he started his career, he started being a leader of the Jewish people. He was 80. Right? So he tells the story of this Jerry Graff said, I didn't know. And he said, the Rebbe banged on the table and passionately said, he was 80 years old and you are very far from that age. So he says, from then on, whenever such thoughts trouble us, my wife and I think of those words that the Rebbe said. Moshe Rabbeinu, he grew up in Egypt, actually grew up in Pharaoh's palace. That's the whole story of Pharaoh's daughter rescuing him, and then he had to run away from Pharaoh. He was actually away from Egypt for many years, and then only the story of the burning bush is when God appeared to him and gave him the job of becoming the leader of the Jewish people, and he helped me, took us out of Egypt, which is what we celebrate on Pesach, right? But he was 80 years old. It says actually, it's not even a midrash, it explicitly says in the Torah. He was 80 years old when he took the Jews out of Egypt. Okay, he lived until 120, but he okay. An interesting little story actually happened with a rabbi here in Sydney, Rabbi Feldman. When he was very young, he once went to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, and the Rebbe told him, there was a rabbi, I don't know if anyone would be familiar with the name, but there was a rabbi a long time ago in Sydney, he was Rabbi Mizrahi actually. His name was Rabbi Abramson. Yeah, you remember him, okay. So Rabbi Abramson was like the stepfather-in-law of Rabbi Feldman, because he was like stepmother of the Gutniks, the Chaim Gutniks. So the Rebbe encouraged Rabbi Feldman to encourage his father-in-law, his stepfather-in-law, whatever, not to retire from community work and to keep doing it, and to be involved in the rabbinate and to keep working and stuff like that. And without thinking, Rabbi Feldman said to the Rebbe, but he's almost 70. As soon as he said that, he realized it was such an embarrassing thing because he was talking to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was close to 70 at that time. Right? So the Rebbe gave him a big smile, and he said to Rabbi Feldman, I'm also 70. He was already 70 then. And I have plans for 10 years and another 10 years after that. It actually is quite amazing because the Rebbe had the stroke just before he was 90. And he mentioned the 10 years and the 10 years, which was very interesting. And that's where it was. I remember, the Rebbe was a special person, it's true. He had probably different powers than we have, but I remember that's when I first came to New York to learn by the Rebbe. It was in 1982, and I remember the Farbrengen that the Rebbe had for his 80th birthday, where he went for hours and hours, and made it very clear that he was nowhere near from slowing down. And the next few years were very, very active. But that particular Farbrengen was something out of this world. He went for many, many hours, many, many talks, and then in honor of his 80th birthday, they had printed a new edition of the Tanya, and he said there was a huge crowd there. And he said that after he finishes the Farbrengen, he's going to give every single person a Tanya. I have that Tanya today also, I was there. And he kept giving them out until like 6 a.m. So he was an 80-year-old. And then the next few years was actually what we know now as the network of the shluchim, the emissaries, right? The thousands and thousands. That took a whole new turn in the 80s when the Rebbe was 80 years old, and in the 80s, like 83, 84, I remember when I got married, it was 87. He was sending people out. He was encouraging. He was motivating. So the growth of the movement actually took on He was amazing, and it was close to 90 at the time. But that was his. It wasn't just him having that extra koyach. It was his philosophy. Philosophy is never too late, and it doesn't matter what you did before, what you didn't do before. Every day is a new day. Every time is a new time. Every period is a new opportunity, and so on and so forth. Now, what we need to understand, of course, is that what often stands in the way of fixing a mistake, or changing a habit, or improving, or realizing that no matter how old we are, we can still change and grow, and so on. The thing that stands in the way of that is the temptation of despair. Right? It's a big temptation. Why do I call it a temptation? Because the truth is that despairing is very attractive sometimes. Why? Know why? Why is it easier to despair than to do something? Sorry? Yeah, it's an escape. Right? It's an escape. Basically what it is, despair can, or as it seems can, be sometimes actually relaxing and excusing us from growth, and despair is a subtle way of giving up responsibility. That's what it is, right? Okay, spiritually speaking, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. It comes from the inner voice that is negative, right? We have two voices within us, but it does, because it's very attractive, because it's a victim mentality. That's what it is. It's the prelude to victimhood, and I can't, and it's too hard, and I'm too old, and I've been too far gone, and I've failed too much, and I've messed up too many times, and so on, right? And messing up, by the way, is not an impediment to growth, or never should be an impediment to growth. No. Someone told me the other day, now, never take business commentary from me, but I'm just quoting someone else, okay? But someone told me an amazing thing, actually. That, Israel, as we know, is a very big startup nation, right? And a lot of startups. And apparently, there's a huge difference between Israel and Australia. I don't know anything about it. I'm just quoting what someone told me, but it was a beautiful idea. Apparently, when investors invest in startups in Israel, they are more. It's more often that they'll invest in someone that's tried a startup and failed, and they dafka want that person, because when people fail and they want to start again, they've learned something. You hope, at least, anyways, right? Whereas well, I'm not talking about anything. I'm just talking about Israel. Apparently, in Australia, it's not like that. Apparently, in Australia, when you start up something, you fail, you get cancelled. I don't know. But anyway, but certainly in Israel it's not that way, and it's a very Jewish idea. It's a very Jewish concept. Failure shouldn't be an impediment to growth. But when we fail, and when we are older, when we give up, and when we've done it too many times, then we have this thing that despair becomes the attractive option, right? And when despair becomes the attractive option, that's a really, really problem. Because if we say, I've tried, but I haven't succeeded, and all that kind of thing, the Talmud says, anytime a person says, I've tried and not succeeded, you don't believe them. In other words, it means you can try more. And effort will bring results. One of the great Hasidic masters was a famous Rabbi Nachman. If you go to Israel today, you can see a lot of Rabbi Nachman next to Breslau. But Rabbi Nachman was actually a serious tzaddik. He was a serious person. He was, Rabbi Nachman from Uman, exactly. There's different groups that adhere to him. Some of them are more crazy than others. But Rabbi Nachman himself was a descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, a great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. He lived in Ukraine.
Yeah, they all run now.
Yeah, they go to Rosh Hashanah, yeah. So he lived in Ukraine, and in a town called Breslau, which is Breslov. And he was very, very, very into meditative prayer and what he called hitbodedut, talking to God, your own personal things. And he wrote a lot of books. But one of the underlying themes of his books was self-encouragement, and to encourage yourself to know, as he puts it, and as the Breslovers sing it today, Ein yi'ush ba'olam. There's no despair in the world. There's no such thing as despair, right? In other words, and that really goes to the heart of what Jewishness is all about. In Jewishness, in Judaism, one of the fundamental principles is that we don't give up. There's always the hay. That's what I said before. This is chometz and matzah. There's always the hay. There's always that little window. It might be tough. You've got to climb to get back. That's true. You got to work hard to make a comeback, but it's always possible. Actually, again, coming up to Pesach, we learn this from the festival of Pesach, right? When the Jews left Egypt, we are told that's why there's 49 days of the Omer after that. Why is it 49 days? Because Kabbalistically, there are 49 levels of impurity, right? There's actually 50 levels, but the 50 level apparently is like a point of no return, but we'll see that if that's accurate or not. But the 49th level is pretty bad. The 49th level is kind of as low as you can go. And the Jews in Egypt are actually spiritually they were very, very damaged. Although they were descendants of our matriarchs and our patriarchs, and they had God's promise He would take them out of Egypt and so on, but they themselves actually, although they're kept distinctly as a separate tribe, but actually they were very, very assimilated. They were pagan worshippers. They had given up hope. At the beginning, they didn't want to even listen to Moshe Rabbeinu when he came. It says in the Pasuk, V'lo sham'u el Moshe, they wouldn't listen to Moses because they were short breathed. What does that mean, they're short breathed? They'd given up, right? Just because, it's hard. It's hard to keep hoping. It's hard sometimes. As failure repeats itself, it becomes harder and harder to keep up the hope. And yet, God took them out of Egypt. And yet they were able to come out. And then God gave them a 49-day program to go into the 49 levels of holiness, right? Interesting enough, we just came from Purim. As I told you, Purim is even higher than Yom Kippur, right? Purim is the highest festival. Purim, we are told, some of the mystics say, that the 49 levels of impurity, that's where they could come from. But the 50th level, that's where that was like, would have been a point of no return. But that was before the Torah was given. Once afterwards, and especially on Purim, they say that Purim has the power to come out even of the 50th level of it. Because there's no such thing as a point of no return, which we'll demonstrate soon in a very, very powerful way. Right? Now, I tell you the story about Pesach because when we talk about failure and not despairing and always believing in the ability to come back and to grow and to improve and so on, that's both if it's physical challenges or spiritual challenges. When I talk about Pesach, I'm talking more about the spiritual challenges, right? So whether we failed emotionally, psychologically, physically, whether the challenge is physical or spiritual, it actually makes no difference because we can always have hope. We should never despair, and we can always come back. And when we have that attitude, then we can always implement the things we talked about over the last 7 weeks and the last term. We can talk about those strategies. We can be motivated to apply those strategies and to try them, but it comes on a foundation of never ever giving up hope. I want to share with you an insight, which has nothing to do with Pesach or time of the year, but just a beautiful insight which I might have shared with you this many years ago, I don't remember, but a couple of insights about this, but this is a particularly beautiful one which I read once. It was written by a rabbi, his name was Rabbi Wolfson. He just passed away last year, he was 104. So an amazing person. And he wrote many, many books and fascinating commentary. And he wrote one commentary on something which I always remember this because it got stuck in my head. It was just like an amazing idea. But I have to give a bit of context. Later on in the Torah, there's a mitzvah. One of the 630 mitzvot relate to what they call a ben sorer umoreh, the wayward son. Right? It's one of the. What's the wayward son? Here's the simple reading of it. It's a difficult reading because it seems like a very different to what the Torah would normally say. But here's the reading of it, right? The reading of it is that if a couple have a wayward son, which means like it's about a 30-year-old son, who's out of control, and he's stealing, and he's indulging, he's stealing meat, and he's drinking wine, and he's in bad company, and the whole thing, and a whole bunch of different laws, and he's already violated theft and so on and so forth. There are certain circumstances where the Torah says that, when there was temple times and there was a Sanhedrin, would on occasion, not very often, but on occasion would apply the concept of capital punishment. But for a crime, that's very, very serious, right? In this case, the child who refuses to mend his ways, and they've tried everything, they've punished him and everything, he refuses to do anything, they take him to Bet Din, and the Bet Din could apply capital punishment, and they kill him. That's the reading of the Torah, right? Now, why do they do that? So the Talmud says they do that for the following reason, which is very hard to understand until you'll hear the explanation. They do it because it says the Ben Sor, the wayward son, is judged on his future, which is not normally what we do, right? We normally judge someone in their past, not in their future. What's the future? Because since he's out of control, he seems to be completely is a train wreck waiting to happen. So all the stealing and all the theft that he's done, all the aggression that he's done, he's going to end up killing someone. Because he's going to go on the highway, he's going to end up attacking someone, and he's going to end up killing someone. So rather than wait for him to kill someone, we'll kill him first so we avoid the death of the person in the future. That's the simple reading of the Chumash. Okay. Talmud says that actually this mitzvah never happened. Never happened. Why did it never happen? Because it's statistically impossible to happen. Because the way it works is, if you look at the laws and the specifics of this mitzvah, first of all, it's talking about a child that's at a very specific age. It's like from when it turns 13 until 3 months later, then it doesn't apply anymore. Second of all, there's a certain amount of meat he has to steal, a certain amount of wine, and there's certain things that parents have to be willing, and the parents have to be similar height and similar. There's so many details. The Torah made this mitzvah, which is a strange thing. Right? The Torah makes this mitzvah, then puts in so many conditions that statistically it actually is impossible to happen. So the Talmud says, Lo haya v'lo yiyeh. It never happened and never will happen. Meaning never be applied. So the Talmud then asks, in the discussion of the Talmud is a very discussion type book. The Talmud says, well, that's interesting. So then why did God bother giving us the mitzvah? And the Talmud answers, Yagdil Torah v'yadir, just to have more Torah to learn. That's a simple reading of it. So we should have another chapter, another concept, another discussion to have. Okay, but what does it mean? So why specifically this mitzvah? Couldn't you make up another mitzvah for us to discuss? Like, what does this mean? What's more puzzling is, in the Talmud where it says that it never happened and never will happen, there's a dissenting opinion. I think it's Rabbi Yossi, if I'm not mistaken. He says, no, it happened. I was at the grave of one of these sons. Now, this becomes a very big problem. You know, you can have a dispute. We have lots of disputes in the Talmud, but you can have a dispute on what the halakha is. Should you light candles of Hanukkah 1 to 8 or 8 to 1? Okay, that's a halachic dispute. Right? And there's thousands of halachic disputes, and there's a whole system of how we rule. Okay, good. But you can't dispute the fact, right? Unless there's a different interpretation of it. But you can't say, one's got to be wrong, right? Because when we talk about it, just so you understand what I'm actually trying to say, we have this principle in the Talmud, when there's halachic disputes, no one's wrong. Actually, it's different legitimate Torah perspectives. We just then have a system of who you should follow. But they're actually both true. In other words, they're both legitimate perspectives, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't make it into the Talmud. If the opinion makes it in the Talmud, it's because it's based on a true Torah perspective. But when you have a factual dispute, it's a very hard thing. What do you mean? It either happened or didn't happen. And when he comes and he says, I saw the grave of one of them, well then, it obviously happened then. What do you mean it didn't happen, right? You can't, he's a liar. He was there by the grave, right? So this Rabbi Wolfson gives the most phenomenal interpretation. And he says the following. He says, no, they're actually not arguing. It never happened. So what do you mean after the grave? He says like this. First of all, the principle, the foundation of this is very difficult to understand. Because the foundation is exactly the opposite of everything I've said for the last half an hour. How can you say that Torah would give us a mitzvah to give up hope on someone? Basically, that's what it is, right? You're giving up hope. You're saying this guy that's it. He's at a point of no return, and he's going to end up killing someone. How do you know? Maybe you won't. Maybe he'll turn around. Doesn't seem likely. Okay, but that's the Jewish principle, that we don't give up hope. Not on ourselves, not on other people. He says, no, you don't understand. He says, that's the depth of this mitzvah. The Torah gives us a mitzvah. The mitzvah is about an individual, right? It's about an individual that looks like is reaching a point of no return. It's an individual that looks like maybe we just get rid of him because he's going to just destroy the world, right? And then the Torah says, yeah, okay, I get you. I'm giving you this mitzvah. I'm putting you on that trajectory and that thought process. Now I'm going to make this mitzvah so difficult that statistically it's going to be impossible to happen. You know why? This is what the Talmud means. The Torah should be great. What does it mean Torah should be great? Because says God, I want to teach you that no matter how much it seems that someone is at a point of no return, there's no such thing. And that's why I'm going to make this mitzvah so hard that it won't happen. Just to teach you a lesson. I'm going to construct the mitzvah so that you think, yeah, that's logical. Maybe this guy's such a mess. There's not even no point investing in him because he's just not going to be able to repay himself, not going to be able to turn around. And then I'm going to make the conditions of the mitzvah so difficult that it's impossible to happen, to teach you that you never give up on anyone. And then he says something unbelievable, very novel, very creative. He says, and then the second opinion in the Talmud comes and says, and he's not arguing. He says, you're right. You know why? Because I was at a grave. What is he doing at the grave of a wayward son, right? He says, no. What he's trying to say is this. He says, there was a kid like this, and of course the mitzvah wasn't applied because it was too difficult, the conditions weren't met. And he ended up turning himself around, and he became a big tzaddik, and he died and he was buried, and I visited his grave because I wanted to pray there. No, that's a very creative idea, right? He says, you're right, of course. And that's a proof. A proof to what he's saying is that there was such a kid who, if not for the strict conditions that the Torah laid, might have met the criteria, and we might have ended up killing him, applying the capital punishment, and we didn't because it's impossible, and therefore we turned him around, and he became such a great person that I was actually at his grave. I visited his grave. So, if it's true, right, if it's true that we're not allowed to give up hope in anyone, and that even a ben sorry rumora, even a wayward son, who has really and truly descended into a very dark place, and yet that what the Torah is actually teaching us is that you can't give up on him, so how much more so we can't give up on each other, and we can't give up on ourselves. That's the message. The message, we can never give up on ourselves, no matter how bad we are, or we think we are, or no matter how many mistakes we've made, on whatever level, whatever context, we always have to believe in that little top window of the hay that we can always creep back in. Yeah.
It seems to me that that's a very long way around declaring that you don't believe in capital punishment.
Well, no, first I don't say we don't believe in capital punishment. Actually, the Torah does actually believe in capital punishment. That's another discussion. There is capital punishment in the Torah for very serious crimes, but it's not very, also the conditions there are also quite complicated and hard to meet, and therefore it's more used as a deterrent more than actually applied, but it was applied. Throughout history there was times where capital punishment was applied. So that's another discussion why the Torah does believe actually in capital punishment.
I've got a different question. What about you believe in a person and they don't buy into the belief themselves?
Oh, that's a problem. That's a big problem.
They have to buy it.
Of course, that's my next thing I'm going to talk about. So let's go back to your question. So this is a different story. This is about a person who actually wasn't deserving yet of capital punishment. He hadn't done a crime that's serious enough. But he was in a very dark space. And therefore the Torah sort of wants to teach us a lesson by saying, you might think that maybe it's just worth like cutting it now because there's no hope.
But that sort of goes against the beliefs anyway, because you don't make a judgment about somebody.
Correct, but sometimes we do. Sometimes we say a person is so dark, it doesn't look like... We often give up. We give up on ourselves. That's the point here. The point is that although it's not, we don't give up, we don't reach that point that the Torah is talking about, but actually we do. We make a judgment on ourselves and we make judgment on other people. Sometimes we do think that person is not happening. Like, now, on any level, right? Like, for example, I've told the story before. I'll just tell you a quick story. There was a story of the first Chabad Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe. He came, on any level, could be any example, right? He came to a city and he was collecting money for something very important. He was collecting money to release someone who had been taken into captivity by the evil regime of Russia, right? Which used to happen sometimes, and they would then, the only way to get them out was called Pidyon Shvuyim. You had to ransom them back. And so he came and he was raising money for this, and it was a very serious thing, and it's a very big mitzvah, the Talmud says. And he asked the guy in charge, the president of the shul, the president of the community, to give him a list of people who can go in, and he gave him a list. And then he said, but I believe that Mr. So-and-so lives here also, he should be able to give quite a bit, no? So the guy starts to laugh, he says, him, you're never going to get a penny out of him. Never going to get a penny out of him. He's such a miser, such a this, never gonna, nothing. He says, give me his address. Okay. So he went to him, and then later, a couple of days later, the president meets him and says, no, how did you go? He says, he paid for the whole thing. He says, how can we? He says, very simple, I'll tell you exactly what happened. I went to see him. He was very respectful. He invited me in, as you always do with everyone. And then he says, what can I do for you, Rabbi? And I told him the whole story. So he got up and he went to his safe and he came back with a very old, rusty, tiny copper coin. So I took it and I said, thank you. And I left. He comes after me and he calls me back. He says, I'll give you another coin. And this kept on happening, and the copper coins went to silver coins, and the silver coins went to bigger coins, and he paid the whole thing. So the president says to him, so what was your trick? He says, very simple. This person, everyone has their tests, and everyone has their challenges, right? This person had a blockage, a spiritual blockage in his heart. Just couldn't give. It's very hard for him. Sometimes it happens, right? And what used to happen is, everyone would come to him, and they would ask him to help, for tzedakah, for charity, and he would end up giving this copper coin, and everyone would become really, really upset and throw it back at him. Like chutzpah, I made a special trip to you, you're such a big, your house, look at your house, and did you give me a copper coin? And the blockage just kept getting stronger and stronger. I said, I took the copper coin and I thanked him. And I thanked him properly, and the blockage started to melt a little bit. So he came back and he asked me to come back again, he did it again, and kept on coming back and back and back until it melted completely, and again. So we have these stories that we judge other people. We do that. And that's the Torah's message here. We might not judge people to the point that we're going to kill them, but the point is we do judge people, and we do make judgments about ourselves and about other people. That I don't think you're going to succeed with that person, right? And that's Torah teaching. I'm going to give you a scenario of someone that's such a dark place, and I'm going to tell you, don't give up on them. And according to Rabbi Wolfson, that's what the Talmud is telling us, that Rabbi Yossi actually had a living example of it, of someone that was in that situation, actually made a complete turnaround. So that's important. However, as Shirley says, there's one thing, when we talk about ourselves and other people, there's one thing that you need for that to happen, and that is personal responsibility. You have to take responsibility for yourself and be motivated. You have to own the problem. You have to say it's not, other people will help, and they should help and inspire, and you can look for good friends, and you can look for a good environment, and you look, but at the end of the day, we have to believe ourselves, never give up on ourselves, but also take responsibility for ourselves, right? And I've told you the story that the Talmud says, but there's a small detail of that story, which is so important. The Talmud talks about a person who was also a very, very big gangster, a guy who had transgressed every bit of immorality in the world, right? And what happened was he once paid a lot of money, and he traveled to be immoral with a particular woman. And in the middle of the whole process, she said something to him like, your life is pretty empty, and something triggered in him, right? And he became like, suddenly he realized he'd spent his whole life just empty. And he really, really wanted to return. He wanted to return to God. So the Talmud says the following, that he went down and he sat between two mountains, right? And he said the following. He said, mountains and hills, pray for mercy on my behalf, so my repentance should be accepted. And the Talmud says that the mountains and the hills answered him, we have to pray for our own behalf. On our own behalf, we can't pray for you. So he said, heaven and earth, pray for mercy on my behalf. And they said to him, no, before we pray for you, we have to pray for ourselves. And then he did the same thing with the sun and the moon. And he wasn't helping. That's what the Talmud is saying, right? And finally, Elazar ben Dodai said, clearly, this thing depends on nothing else but myself. And he started to pray himself and cry out to God. Now, stories of repentance are not supposed to end the way this one did, but it did. It did end that way. We actually cried and cried and cried until his soul left his body and he actually expired. He died. And that time, a heavenly voice came out, says the Talmud, a heavenly voice came out and said, welcome, Rabbi Elazar ben Dodai. In other words, his tshuva, his repentance, had been fully accepted. But why was it fully, what's the meaning of this cryptic sort of description of the mountains and the hills and all that kind of stuff? The answer is because sometimes we want to change, but we want someone else to do it for us. And that doesn't work. Someone else can have compassion, someone else can be supportive, someone else can help us. But at the end of the day, we have to believe in our own ability, but we also have to take responsibility for our own ability. Right? And this comes out in a very, very beautiful idea, another beautiful insight of another biblical story. Such an amazing thing. Also, the Rebbe points this out in a talk. It's one of my favorites, this one. Where, you know the story of, I always go back to the stories of Joseph, because it's always, there's so much in it, right? But one of the stories, not the normal ones I told, but one of the stories of Yosef was the following. You know, when his brothers first came down and he recognized them in the whole story, they didn't bring down the youngest one, Binyamin, right? And eventually they did. He said, you have to bring him down. And they went back to Yaakov and they said, he doesn't want to see us anymore unless we bring down Binyamin. And he brought Binyamin. Binyamin was very special to Joseph because they came from the same mother. Meaning all the brothers were sons of Yaakov, of Jacob, but they didn't all have the same mother, but him and Binyamin had the same mother, Rachel. Right? And you know, when the Jews went into Israel eventually, right, there were 12 tribes, and each tribe got a portion in the land, correct? So what happened was, I'll just give you the context where we understand the idea. Before the temple was built, there was, for 369 years, there was a temporary temple called Shiloh. It was built in Shiloh. They actually know where it is. You can visit Shiloh today and see it. No, you can't see the ruins of it. You can't see And that was when the Jews, it was in the portion of Yosef. Eventually that was the tribe of Yosef. Actually Yosef divided into two tribes of his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim, but it was in his portion in Israel, right? Eventually when they built a full temple in Jerusalem on Temple Mount, most of Temple Mount, actually the border went through the Temple Mount, but most of Temple Mount was in the portion of Binyamin. Right? So eventually Binyamin comes down to Egypt, and Yosef sees him, and it says that they fell on each, this is what the wording of the Chumash says, they fell on each other's necks and cried. So what's the symbolism? They fell on each other's necks and cried. So the commentary explained, Rashi quotes it as well, that what they were crying for like this. The neck is a symbol, I'm not going to go into why now, but the neck is a symbol of the temple. Because I'll tell you why briefly, because the temple connects the infinite godly consciousness of heaven with the rest of the earth. It's like the neck, it connects the body, the head with the rest of the body. Okay, so a temple is a symbol of a neck is a symbol of a temple, right? So we have in the Talmud a very interesting description. They cried. It says they cried for the destruction of their temples. But this is how it says it. It says Yosef cried for the destruction of Binyamin's temple, the one in Jerusalem. And Binyamin cried for the future destruction of Yosef's temple. Right? So the obvious question is, why are they crying for each other's temple? They each have a temple that's also going to be destroyed. Why are they crying for each other's temple? The answer is very simple. This is what the Rebbe says in a talk, beautiful. He says, you don't cry about your own temple. Your own temple, you get up and you do something about rebuilding it. Right? You cry for someone else's temple that's it's not in your control. You show empathy for someone else. You support someone else. You help build the temple of someone else, but it's not in your control. The other person's temple, they have to build. What you can do is you can support. You can cry. But don't cry for your own temple. Do something about your own temple. Take personal responsibility. That's why they cried for each other's temple, not for their own temple. So that's the first thing we need to do, is to really take personal responsibility. And finally, we also really need to believe in the power of ourselves. As the Talmud says, there's nothing that stands in the way of will. Right? Willpower. Ratzon, the power of Ratzon, as we call it in Hebrew, has the power to overcome anything. And sometimes we just have to dig very, very deep into our own power, and know that no matter how things have happened in the past, we always have the power to grow. We always have the power to overcome, to return, to reconnect, and to grow. And with this, I'll just conclude with a story that I'm sure I must have told you through the years. I just can't always remember exactly where I said what, but I've definitely told this over the story a number of times. But it's worth repeating anyway. And this happened in 1971, in the American winter of 1971. There was a Jew called Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb. He's still alive. He's an older person today. And he had received a PhD in psychology. He was a young guy who was starting to work he was a rabbi, but also he started to work as a clinical psychologist in Maryland, in Spring Valley, Maryland. And he says, as he tells the story, I've heard him tell the story. I heard him speak once. He actually told the story. But I've seen it written. I've seen it on video. He said, I was probably a bit young for a midlife crisis, but he says that's what I was kind of going through. Or maybe I just arrived at it earlier than most, but he says I was deeply torn with a lot of questions. He was married for 7 years at that time. He was had questions about his career, about his family, how to strengthen his marriage, all kinds of things. It was a real crossroads of his life. And he confided in a few close friends, and one of them suggested that he consult with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he was a bit skeptical. He wasn't part of the Hasidic movement at all. He's still not, but he was skeptical. But he decided, you know what has he got to lose, right? So he decided one day just to call the Rebbe's office. And the Rebbe's office, he called it. In those days, in the early years, there was a secretary called Rabbi Charakov. I remember him, he was a very old Jew, but he would sort of often take the calls, and he answered the call. And sometimes when he spoke to people, the Rebbe never spoke to people directly by the telephone, but sometimes he was on the line. So the secretary says, who is this? Can I help? And he says, a Jew from Maryland. He didn't want to say his name. He said, a Jew from Maryland. He said, what's the issue? He says, I have many questions I'd like to discuss with the Rebbe, questions about the direction of my life, about my marriage, about I'm uncertain about many things, and so on and so forth. And suddenly he hears the Rebbe's voice in the background in Yiddish, saying, Zogem, tell him, Asido Ayid in Maryland, that there's a Jew in Maryland, his name is Weinreb. And he should speak to him. Remember, the Rebbe, he didn't say his name, right? So he couldn't believe his ears. And the secretary asked him, did you hear what the Rebbe said? So he said no, because he wanted to hear it again. So he wanted to... So he said, repeated the Rebbe's words, tell him there's a Jew who lives in Maryland, he could speak to, his name is Weinreb. So he said, but my name is Weinreb. I'm that guy, right? So he hears the Rebbe say, on the line, he hears the Rebbe saying, Oy bazoi, if that's the case, tell him to speak to himself. No, right? He went on to become a very respected psychologist, a rabbi, a very functional person. And I think the point is this. You've heard me say many times that talking to yourself is not always a good idea because you don't know where your voice is coming from. But he took it a bit differently. He took it that sometimes what the Rebbe is saying is, you're concerned about a lot of things, you need to look within yourself. You need to find your own power. Right? That doesn't mean you shouldn't consult other people. It doesn't mean you always have to trust yourself. But you have to turn within. You have to discover yourself. You have to discover your true power. I don't mean like they say today, your authentic self, because that can mean 100,000 things. But I mean like discover who you really are, what you're really capable of doing. And he says that this is now like, I don't know, 40 years later, whatever it is, more than 40 years later, he always says when he told the story, he said, yeah, it's 53 years later, but I think we told the story, it was like 40 years later. And he said, whenever he has a crisis, this is what he does. He remembers that very, very clearly. And that's the truth of what has to happen. We don't, like, you talk about judging others, we judge ourselves. We judge others too, which we shouldn't, but we do judge ourselves as well. Sometimes we overinflate ourselves, sometimes not, but sometimes we write ourselves off. We just think, no, I'm not able to do this. It's too hard. I'm too old. It's been too many times. And what we have to do is we have to turn to ourselves and realize, take responsibility, but also realize the power that we have to take that responsibility. And that's the foundation of everything else. Sorry?
I remember in earlier lectures, he spoke about that we shouldn't judge ourselves, like in the court.
Yeah.
Saying that you need to be objective.
Right.
You're not objective.
No, so obviously so that's what I'm saying. That's why the Rebbe said that to someone who obviously would understand it properly. In other words, not that you should trust yourself in terms of coming to a conclusion. You should always consult with others. It's basic Pirkei Avot, right? Make yourself a mentor, have a friend, and so on and so forth. But it's got to come from yourself. In other words, you've got to be committed and motivated and realize that you have all these questions and problems that shouldn't be holding you back. Go deep within yourself and find your power. Then, of course, you want to know exactly what to do. Of course, you've got to discuss with other people. He wasn't saying, talk to yourself and you'll find the answer. Talk to yourself means turn to yourself and you'll find your strength.
It's such an interesting one. I'm doing the JLR course on relationships at the moment. And just last night, Rabbi G was speaking about judge others favorably, judge yourself favorably as well.
Yeah.
So,
But again, you always have to know what that means. Sometimes we judge ourselves favorably means that we don't have to take responsibility. It should never be that. So you have to always know what that means. Very nuanced.
Objective.
Right, but judge yourself favorably means understand that you could do it. You can change. You can believe in yourself. You can believe in yourself. You can go beyond your comfort zone. You can grow. You can improve. You can fix all these things. So just a reminder, this was the end of the series, but we're going to do 2 more weeks, a special series on measures of personal freedom, which is obviously connected to this, but drawing some new insights from the Haggadah and the Seder and so on. So same time, same place, next week and the week after.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.